Are you concerned about your cholesterol levels and worry about your heart health? Are you confused by your cholesterol test results? Have you been prescribed statin medication but feel unsure whether that's the best way forwards? Whether or not you've answered yes to those questions, you're going to find this episode fascinating. I've got the incredible Dr. Jonny Bowden on the show with me, and I honestly could have listened to him all day. And, what we've covered today is stuff that we all need to know. Make sure you listen till the end because Jonny shares fascinating insights into why so many people in the blue zones thrive past 100. Welcome to Thriving Metabolism. I'm Louise Digby, registered nutritional therapist, weight loss expert, and founder of the Nourish Method to Lasting Fat Loss. It's my mission to empower you so that you and your metabolism thrives and you never have to go through diet misery again. Let's dive in. So welcome back. I'm here with Dr. Jonny Bowden, and I'm really excited to have this conversation today because I think there's so many misconceptions when it comes to cholesterol and cholesterol medication. And it also looks a little bit different for women around the time of menopause. So I think there's lots of good stuff that we can get into today. Jonny, it'd be great to start with just hearing a little bit about who you are and what you do.
Well, I'm a board certified nutritionist in America. I have a PhD in what used to be called holistic or integrative nutrition. We now call it functional medicine nutrition. So I was trained in functional medicine, which is basically a way of looking at our issues as all interconnected. So functional medicine doctors, the best example I've ever heard of what a functional medicine doctor does is if you go to a regular doctor with a pain in your foot, they will give you a prescription for a painkiller. If you go to a functional medicine doctor, they'll say, take off the shoe, let's find the tack that is actually causing the pain. So it's a very different way. It's what Peter Attia, is a very famous doctor in America who just wrote a book about anti-aging. He calls it medicine 3.0. Everybody else is practicing medicine 2.0. They're taking care of symptoms, they're taking care of individual things, and functional medicine, or what I do, functional nutrition, looks at how does the thyroid talk to the adrenals? How does the brain communicate with the gut? It's a whole picture, and we look at all of it, not just lab measures like cholesterol or things like that. So that's my orientation. I started life as a professional musician. I kind of changed everything I was doing in the late 80s and kind of got healthy and got interested in health and how to get other people healthy. And I did a career change in 1990 and became a personal trainer at what is now probably one of the biggest health club chains in America, which is called Equinox. I don't think you have it yet in the UK, but it started out as one little gym in Manhattan and became a multi-million-dollar behemoth. And I began as a trainer there. And I became, in a couple of years, the dean of the Equinox Fitness Training Institute, which is how people to this day train trainers to, in biology and the biomechanics and anatomy and all of those things in nutrition. And I was pretty much a dyed-in-the-wool member of the establishment. I believed in low-fat diets. I believed in calorie counting. I believed in losing weight by just working harder on the Stairmaster. And I believed all of this stuff, which I now believe is, utter and complete BS. And I was also, I was one of the people who believed that. And if our clients didn't lose weight on our cockamamie advice, we assumed they were cheating because we could not wrap our minds around the fact that what we were teaching them was wrong. And as soon as I began to question that, everybody started to question my credentials. Well, he's not a doctor. What is he talking about? Saturated fat might not be a bad thing. He doesn't know what he's talking about. He's not even a nutritionist. And that's what caused me to go back to school and get my PhD in nutrition and my board certification. So I could then talk to them and tell them, yeah, you're full of it. And now I have the letters behind my name to show you.
Yeah, that's amazing. And it's amazing that you went back to school to get those credentials so that you could have that conversation. And I'm really glad that I'm sitting here with you having this conversation that we're going to have today, because I think it would go very differently with a conventional medical doctor as opposed
Oh,
to
I can tell,
functional.
believe me, I can guarantee you it would go very differently with conventional doctors. And I'm very aware of their position. One of the best things that happened to me, I did a master's in psychology along the way of doing all of this, which has served me incredibly well in my weight loss coaching and the coaching that I do now privately. But one of the things that I learned in my master's program is that you never really know your argument unless you know the other guy's argument better than he does. So I can tell you the argument for veganism. I can tell you
Mm.
the argument for cholesterol medication, and I can tell you why we're treating heart disease the way we're treating it, and then I'll tell you why it's wrong.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely.
I can
Awesome.
play both parts. You want me to play the conventional medicine doctor? I will tell you exactly why everybody should be on statin drugs and why if your cholesterol is 206, you're going on a statin. I will give you all the research and all the stuff, and then I'll tell
Mm.
you what's wrong about it.
Yeah, and I
So
think the difficult thing is that for your average person who's going to the doctors and they're being told they've got high cholesterol, it's very compelling. You sit down and you talk to someone who is a quote unquote expert in cardiology or whatever it might be. It's very compelling, the argument for taking statins or for lowering your cholesterol. But you know that there's more to it than that. I think there's been a conversation going on for a while now that it's not just a case of cholesterol is bad and high cholesterol is bad. And that's what I want to start doing today, is break that down a bit so that people are armed with the knowledge and can make informed decisions. So perhaps we should really start with talking about what cholesterol actually is and what it means when your doctor says to you, you've got high cholesterol.
yeah, well, I think and there's even if you don't mind, there's even a better place to start, like like that's step number one, but there's kind of a preparation step first,
Mm-hmm.
and is how we measure cholesterol.
Mm.
Because all of this discussion about high cholesterol is based on, I call it 1963 medicine. It's based on good and bad cholesterol. So let's be very clear about something. There is no good and bad cholesterol. Cholesterol under a microscope is the same cholesterol, whether it's carried by an HDL or whether it's carried by an LDL.
Mm.
So it is exactly like I'm Jonny Bowden. I go to an airport. I get on a plane to go to Chicago, or I get on a plane to go to California. I am still the same passenger.
Mm-hmm.
I'm on a different flight. The flights are the HDL and the LDL. The cholesterol is identical.
Mm-hmm.
Start with that.
Yeah.
Now, how did we get this notion of good and bad to begin with? Well, back in the 50s and 60s, we just did total cholesterol, just measured total cholesterol. And you'd go to a health fair and people were trying to be educated about like what to look for in their health metrics. And there would be a doctor sitting at a little booth, in this educational kind of fair that they would have a health fair. And they would take a little prick of your finger and they go, "Oh, Mrs. Jones, your cholesterol is 206. That's quite good. That's fine." And we only knew good. We didn't even know good and bad. And then as technology improved and you could start to look at this stuff a little bit more carefully under microscopes, and we realized that cholesterol doesn't travel in the bloodstream because it's water phobic. It doesn't mix with blood. It has to be in a container.
Mm.
And the containers are different. There's a high density container and there's a low density container. And what does that mean? It just means low density means that it will float and high density means that it will sink. That's all. So the construction of these HDLs and LDLs, high density lipoprotein, low density lipoprotein, is a little different. And they decided, well, one of those lipoproteins kind of takes cholesterol to the organs and the other takes it away. And we know it's awful. So if it takes it away, that's probably the good one. So we're going to call that good and bad. All right. It's very simplistic, but it worked for 1963. We're 60 years into this. We now know there's 13 different subtypes of cholesterol. There's HDL2 and HDL2A and 2B and LDL, oxidized LDL and LP little a. And there's a million different types and they don't all behave the same and they're different sizes. And that makes a big difference as well,
Mm.
because The big fluffy LDLs don't really do anything bad. They're just neutral. They're not good for you. They're not bad for you. They're totally neutral. But the little dense LDLs, boy, those are atherogenic. Those are the ones that get caught. Anyway, your doctor's not looking at any of that. And that's, so when we're even talking about high cholesterol, I say, how'd you measure it? Doing good and bad? Because giving a diagnosis and prescribing medicine based on good and bad is like making a diagnosis based on short and tall. Short and tall are two variables. You might want to know them, but you're going to do a medical diagnosis based on whether he's short or tall? Are you kidding? So my advice to anyone who's been told you have high cholesterol is, doctor, measure it using the modern tests. The doctor will say insurance doesn't cover it. I say pay for it. So, because that's the only test that's going to tell you if you've got anything that you should be concerned about. I am a perfect example. I have absolutely perfect cholesterol by the old measures for years. Under 200 LDL 100, just fantastic, until I learned this stuff and said, wait a minute, how about giving me the NMR particle test or the cardio IQ or the advanced lipid profiling? There's a million different names for them, but they all do the same thing. They measure all the types and subtypes of cholesterol. They tell you how many lipoproteins you have. And why is that important? Well, let's say you're a traffic cop and you're in charge of preventing accidents, and there's a corner where there's a lot of accidents. What data do you want to know to prevent those accidents? Do you want to know how many passengers are in the car? Do you want to know what's in the glove compartment of the car? Do you want to know whether they're carrying soda? You want to know how many cars there are on the road, because that's the data that will tell you if there's a likelihood of accidents. The more cars, the more likelihood of an accident. You're a bouncer in a bar, the more people, the more likelihood somebody's going to step on somebody's toe, somebody's going to get mad, somebody's going to spill a drink, somebody's going to have a fight because there's just too many people there. That's what we want to know. How many lipoproteins are in the water? Cholesterol's the cargo. Cholesterol's what's in the glove compartment. Cholesterol didn't cause the heart attack. Cholesterol spilled out when you had the car accident.
Yeah, I'm loving these analogies.
Blaming cholesterol for the heart attack is like blaming the firemen for the fire. Yes, the firemen show up. Yes, they're there, but they didn't light the match.
Yeah.
So we're measuring cholesterol wrong, and Louise, and that's the first thing to know. You don't base a prescription based on total cholesterol. And as Peter Attia says, to quote him again, because he wrote the best book on anti-aging ever, total cholesterol is as related to heart disease and your chances of getting a heart attack as your hair color. That's how statistically relevant that is. So we need to look a little bit more closely. And that's, I guess, the first message of this. So now to go back to your question, what is it? It's a sterol, which is just basically a waxy substance. It's very useful for a lot of things. It's utterly necessary for the brain and for thinking and for memory. Without cholesterol, you would die. Yeah, I mean, you cells wouldn't function, nothing would work. So it's something that we need very badly. And proof of that is that if you don't eat it, your body will make it because we need it. So this obsessive idea of just lowering total cholesterol is just very ill-advised. It's not really the heart of the matter. What you want to know is that cholesterol getting inflamed? Is it the little kind that gets caught in the arterial wall, or is it the big fluffy kind that doesn't do much damage? You want to know the size, you want to know the number. Those are the things to know about. And that's basically when I talk about in my book, The Great Cholesterol Myth, I'm talking about not the myth that cholesterol is involved in heart disease, it is, but the myth that it causes it, and that's the only metric we should be looking at, and that trumps inflammation, oxidative damage, stress, sugar intake. Those are the factors, not how much cholesterol is in your lipoproteins.
Yeah.
So I think it's not that we're saying that this is useless stuff and it's not related. We're saying this is not the main thing we should be looking for if we're trying to keep people healthy and happy and long-lived.
Yeah, such important information. And it's just music to my ears to hear you talking about spreading that message of how there's so much more to heart health and
So
general
much
health than
more.
just cholesterol.
In our book, The Great Cholesterol Myth, we spent about a third of the book talking about things that had nothing to do with diet and exercise. Stress, relationships, community, sunlight, sleep. I mean, these things are huge factors in health.
Yeah.
And to just have this myopic focus on a lab value that's particularly one that is kind of out of date, at least if you're going to measure it properly and then tell me there's a problem.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah, and you could have totally normal cholesterol levels, but not be sleeping well, be highly stressed, eating a very inflammatory diet. And those are all things that are going to have a far greater impact on your cardiovascular health.
100%.
And I also just want to add a note for the people in the UK, because obviously you talked about testing in relation to insurance not covering the more
Oh, yes.
advanced testing. Over in the UK, we won't get any sort of test like that through our doctors. You do need to go private, and that might mean working with a nutritional therapist or a functional medicine doctor to be able to
The tests are
access.
not that expensive, by the way. And, it's really, this is where medicine leads into politics and economic policy and stuff like that, because insurance companies control all of this stuff. It's not even, I used to blame this all on the doctors until I realized that, yeah, they're at the mercy of the insurance companies too, because if they start prescribing tests that aren't covered, they get audited.
Mm.
And they can lose their connection to Blue Cross Blue Shield, and then they're out of business.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, they're stupid for not keeping up with the research and knowing this stuff, and that makes me angry at them. But they're not completely at fault, because they are really being puppeted by the insurance companies that control what will and will not be done in the doctor's office, what is going to be covered.
Sure.
And I think the more people start to think, healthcare is really important. And like, if I have to pay a little of this out of my own money, I am quite convinced statins are a $31 billion business. If people really knew what the statistics on statins were, and they were presented honestly and fairly, and they said, you got to pay for this, and it's going to cost, I don't even know what it costs, but even if it was $50 a month, and you gave them that info, I doubt that many people would be on statins.
Mm. Mm-hmm.
But it's insurance covers it. Oh, you got, doctor says you got too high cholesterol. They're using total. No, you got to go on a statin drug. Sure, insurance covers it. No problem. They don't even think about it.
Yeah, and
We
over
need to start
here,
thinking about these things, not just in terms of does insurance cover it.
there are some doctors' practices that will just prescribe statins once someone hits 60, and not based on their actual needs or symptoms or
Yeah.
blood
Well, here's a
results.
couple of pieces of data that might be interesting to you. There's a study in the United States. It's the longest running study of diet and health outcomes. It's called the Framingham study. And in the Framingham study, the people with the highest cholesterol live the longest. After 70, 75, statins and cholesterol don't even, I mean, actually, it's very protective to have higher cholesterol at that level. And what people also don't realize is that there is not a linear relationship between low cholesterol and health. If cholesterol gets very, very high, you can assume some of that is the bad stuff, and it's probably a problem. But if it gets very, very low, your risk for death from a whole other category of things goes up.
Mm-hmm.
Accidents, suicides, traffic. Now, why would that happen? Because you need cholesterol for the brain. And if you get it out of the brain, other things happen. Maybe you don't get heart disease, but boy, you're this much more likely to die of other stuff. So we don't want to keep driving cholesterol as low as it can possibly go. That is just, to me, does not make a lot of sense.
Mm-hmm. I agree.
And I think that there are some doctors who I respect who would disagree with that and say, look, this is the stuff that goes bad. If we just get it down as low as possible, then even we'll be lowering the bad ones as well as the neutral ones. And a case can be made. I think it's an obsession with a lab test rather than with a patient.
Mm.
And in functional medicine, we treat the patient, not the lab test.
Sure. Are there circumstances where taking a statin and getting cholesterol as low as possible does make sense? Or is it a case of, for most people, actually it's not about how much cholesterol they have. It's more about the types of cholesterol and that sort of thing.
I think that's a very big distinction. I mean, like I said, my regular total and LDL were great. And then I got the advanced test, and boy, I was in high risk for a number of things. My particle number was huge, and what they call pattern A versus pattern B. That means, are most of those LDLs the big fluffy kind? That's pattern A, that's good, or most of them the small ones that are most likely to cause damage? And
Mhm.
that's pattern B. And I had pattern B, and I had too many of them. So that's a whole different risk picture
Yeah.
than good and bad cholesterol, which is just so silly that I can't even make myself say it anymore. Good and bad cholesterol. I mean, it was
Yeah.
literally invented because they thought nobody's going to understand this stuff. It's too complicated. Let's just make it really simple. This is good. This is bad. And I'll tell you another little secret. We have always known, the people who authored this theory, the people who put this together and used their influence to make these be they always knew that eating cholesterol did nothing. Nothing. But they figured the Americans are just too stupid to make that distinction. So we're just going to say cholesterol is bad. We're
Mm.
not going to say, look, you can eat it, but because eating cholesterol has virtually zero effect on blood cholesterol. Virtually zero, with one exception. And the exception is a condition called familial hypercholesterolemia. These are people who are genetically born with a very, very rare, I think it's less than 1% of the population. It might even be less than 0.5%. I'm not sure, but it's very low. And if you're born with that, you get high of all the bad kinds of cholesterol by just looking at something, and that requires different kind of treatment. It's not my specialty. Steve Sinatra, my co-author on The Great Cholesterol Myth, was a cardiologist. He knew a lot about that. Anyone I see who has familial hypercholesterolemia, I send to a cardiologist. But the exception of those people, eating cholesterol has zero effect on your blood. So
That's
when
so
I give
interesting.
people who are not eating egg yolks, one of the healthiest foods in the world for the brain, because it's got cholesterol, I want to tear the hair that I have left out of my head. So
Yeah,
eat
I
the
agree.
eggs, eat the shrimp, stop worrying about cholesterol in food. That's one take-home point right now. You do not have to worry about eating cholesterol.
Yeah, amazing. And this is something that I've spoken about before, talk about my clients all the time. And I think a lot of people have a real hard time accepting it because it's been so driven into them that
Yeah.
cholesterol is bad, don't eat cholesterol, eat low fat, and all of these things that are actually depriving them of really nourishing food. So it's so great to hear that message. Now, I want to get into in a little bit talking about some more practical things that people can be doing to improve their heart health. But before we get onto that, I want to talk a little bit specifically about menopause because we know that we're more likely to have cardiovascular problems or events during that time or as a result of menopause. So I'd love to hear your thoughts on that and why that happens and what we can do about it as well.
Well, I can speak in a general way about this. I have spoken at a few menopause summits where they discuss this from they have different experts discussing it from different points of view. I don't consider myself an expert on menopause, but I do know, my wife went through it. I certainly, I know a little bit about it from both a practical and a theoretical point of view. And clearly, when you have those kinds of relatively dramatic hormonal changes that take place over a number of years, some of those hormones, like estrogen, are protective of some things. I mean, there are cancers that are hormone dependent that estrogen can feed, but it also protects the bones. It also
Mm.
does a lot of good things. So when you have those kinds of changes, you can be vulnerable to a lot of different things. But in my opinion, the diet that I would recommend for people in menopause is pretty much the same diet I recommend for people who are not in menopause, and same diet I recommend for men. I don't think everybody needs real food. Real food. And I'm asked on podcasts all the time, what's the take-home piece of nutrition advice you can, what can we leave our listeners with that will absolutely make sense in this environment in which they're given so much contradictory dietary information. And you got the vegans and the carnivores and the low fat and the high fat and the paleo, and everybody is completely confused. And I tell them the best advice anyone has ever given me in my entire nutrition career of 32 years, and the best advice I have ever given anyone else is this: eat real food, period. Period. And that trumps the diet, that trumps the macronutrient distribution, it trumps everything. So if you start with real food, and a lot of people are confused by what that is. So I have some definitions.
Right.
It's not kale chips. It's kale. It's food that your great grandmother would have recognized as food and known what to do with. In the blue zones, which are these 5 areas around the globe where they have the longest lived healthy centenarians, they went and showed some of the elders supermarket food. And you know what they said? What is this? What do we do with it? It's not, real food is not that. Real food is, look, we grew this. Oh, I know how to, we'll fry that up, or we'll, whatever we do with it, but they know it's food. So I always used to say it's food from what I called the Jonny Bowden 4 food groups. Food you could, in another time, could have hunted, fished, gathered, or plucked. If it came from the ground, fell off a tree, or you could have hunted it, or you could have fished it, it's probably good for you.
Yeah, so important, because we're just inundated with ultra processed food right now, and companies are so good at labeling foods and packaging them to make them look healthy, or use buzzwords
They're not. They're
to
not.
hook in. Yeah, and it's so frustrating, because I have clients come to me all the time with pictures of things that they've bought, and it's like, ugh, it's, I know it looks good, but it's
And it
so
tastes good. Let's be
processed.
very honest.
Mm.
You know, when we were having drug epidemics in this country, and everybody was just, you know, just say no, and the people who made the most impact, it seems to me, were the people who didn't lie about it. They said, look, this stuff feels great.
Mm.
Cost of it is your life. But let's not lie. I understand why you do it. It feels amazing, and it's, you know, but it's horrible. So let's be honest. They make ultra processed food delicious.
Mhm.
Yes, it tastes great. So cocaine also feels great. Doesn't mean I want to do it every day. So
Yeah.
you got to understand that it's very deceptive. It tastes wonderful, looks healthy. It's got some crap on the label that, oh, now with omega-3, whatever they add to it, a little microdose of something to make it sound healthy. It's not. It's deceptive. It's a wolf in sheep's clothing. I mean, I know it's delicious, but that isn't the only way that we need to evaluate food. Find some other things in your life that are delicious. It doesn't have to be junk food.
Yeah,
It
100%.
doesn't even have to be food. You find that people who have the richest lives are those who need the least amount of gratification from things like food and cigarettes and drugs and things like that, because they actually are getting those
Mm.
feelings from other things. So you can't just take their food away, or their cigarettes away, or their addictions away. You have to also give them something else that will kind of fill that need. And that's where life coaching comes in, because it is not just about don't eat this. Well, what am I going to do instead? You're going to go have some fun.
Mhm.
You're not going to notice that you need potato chips 24 hours a day. I'm exaggerating, but that's kind of, you know, the approach.
Yeah, it's such a good example of how nutrition and lifestyle go hand in hand. You know, we can't just focus on one of them. We really need to be thinking about, like you say, making sure that we're meeting our needs, whether that's nutritionally or making sure that we're getting everything that we need to feel good.
Let me give you 2 examples of that. The first is sleep. When you don't sleep well, and by well, I mean the right number of hours for your health and your body type and what you need, and it's a little different for people. It's usually in the 7 to 9 hour range. There aren't many people who can function at high levels with 5 hours sleep. They think they can, but if you get something like the Aura Ring and it tells you how much time you spent in deep sleep and how much in REM sleep and what your heart rate variable, you find out, oh, I'm not doing as well as I thought I was on that 4 or 5 hours. Most people need 7 to 9. When you don't sleep well enough, long enough, restfully enough, hormones change. 2 in particular: ghrelin, which is known as the hunger hormone, and leptin, which is known as the fullness hormone. So now you have less leptin and more ghrelin. That's why when you pull an all-nighter in college, you will eat anything the next day because you're starving. You can't stop eating. So sleep, which no one's looking at when they're talking about losing weight, can be your biggest saboteur. It can literally put weight on. Not sleeping well is a stressor that raises cortisol. Cortisol puts on belly fat. The connections here, just from sleep, which nobody even looks at when they're talking about weight loss, are enormous. You can sabotage a whole diet program with that. So that's a perfect example. The second example of meeting your needs that has more to do with diet is information that is probably fairly new. And that is that we are not eating enough protein. And that especially goes for women, especially goes during menopause. So the cutting edge people now are recommending about 100 grams a day of protein, which is way more. I don't know what they recommend in the UK, but we've been told it's 0.8 grams per kilogram of body weight, which is about 0.4 grams per pound. And people are eating 40, 50 grams of protein a day, and it is not enough to sustain muscle. And we now know that muscle is the organ of longevity. Okay? The organ of Gabriella Lyons says that. She's a wonderful podcaster, doctor here in the States. And it is the organ of longevity. So if you're looking at like not getting frail and being able to open jars and carry groceries out of the car when you're 99, you better eat some more protein.
Yeah, 100%.
And get better sleep. So
Yes.
those are two takeaways right there that are going to help your diet and your weight.
Yeah, and these are things that my listeners have had drummed into them by now. You got to sleep, you got to eat protein. So we've mentioned several things that people can do to improve their overall health as well as their cardiovascular health. We've mentioned sleep, we've mentioned eating real food, making sure you get enough protein, not worrying about avoiding foods that have cholesterol in unless you have cholesterol, I never say it, hyperfamiliar cholesterolemia.
Yeah, right.
Is there anything else big that we're missing?
The rest of life. So I just turned 78, and I have a very full and active life. I got married 6 months ago. I'm madly in love with my wife. We're going.
Congratulations.
Well, we've been together 14 and a half years.
Oh.
But I play tennis every day, 2 hours a day. I go for hikes in the woods with my dog. And I have moments that I don't call, Robert Greene actually named them all moments. Moments when you just stop and go, holy shit. And you just appreciate, I happen to be lucky enough to live in Southern California, so there's gorgeousness outside. This is a background, obviously, but that's kind of what it looks like outside my window. And we don't take enough time for that kind of celebration. And here's why that matters physically. Our nervous system is divided, part of our central nervous system is divided into what they call the sympathetic nervous system and the parasympathetic. Sympathetic is when you're rushing to make a deadline, when you're rushing to make a train, when you're taking the kids to soccer, when you're like, It's called the fight or flight hormone, and the fight or flight stage. And that's sympathetic nervous system. Most of us live in that state 90% of the time. Healing, detoxification, weight loss, fat burning, all take place in the parasympathetic nervous system, which is also known, if the sympathetic is called fight or flight, the parasympathetic is called rest and digest. We don't spend enough time there. How do you get there? Appreciation, gratitude. When you're in an attitude of gratitude, this is not airy-fairy granola-ish, BS. This is real, physiological, neurological, demonstrable. When you are in a state of thinking about things you're grateful for, even if you spend 5 minutes a day, 3 minutes a day, just listing 3 things. My eyes work, my ears work, I can speak. I have a computer. I have a house over my head. Anything that you can list. When you're thinking about that, your physiology changes. You can try that at home, folks. Just take a minute out of the day and sit there and think, well, I have a kid. I have a husband. I have a wife. I have and just think of some of the things that you are just blessed with, and you will feel your physiology change. That's going into parasympathetic nervous system. The more time you can spend there, the more things heal. They don't heal in some, just like weight training. We've all learned this. I hope we've all learned this. Muscle doesn't build when you're doing the exercises because you're actually tearing stuff down and making little micro injuries. Muscle builds in the recovery time. That's when it grows.
Mm.
Same way, all of these things that people come to you and I for, weight loss being very high on that list, it all happens in parasympathetic mode.
Yeah.
Need that relaxation. And guess what happens when you don't sleep? Sympathetic all the way up. The body sees it as a stressor. Cortisol rises. Cortisol puts on belly fat. It shrinks a portion of the brain that has to do with thinking and memory, the hippocampus. So yeah, being in that relaxed state, in that state of gratitude, feeling love, spending time with your animals, walking in nature, these things are so vitally important. When I see clients who are so worried about a metric on their blood test, I tell them my analogy of the health bank. So we all have like a bank account, a health bank account, and we can make withdrawals or we can make deposits. Sometimes when you have a shitty test, a bad test or a bad metric, that's kind of a withdrawal. Or maybe you have a genetic marker that's not so great. That's kind of a withdrawal. But you have to look at all the deposits you're making. And what my clients are always very delighted to find is that they are probably making deposits that they didn't know were deposits. And one who was so upset about this total cholesterol and stuff. And I said, what's your life like? Oh, I've got these great kids and we go sailing and I just love it. When, dude, that means more than that metric.
Mm.
In the whole picture, you have made 10 times the deposit that metric is making as a withdrawal.
Mm-hmm.
So a lot of it is realizing that, the rest of life that isn't compartmentalized into what does your blood test say and not that they're not important. Don't get me wrong at all about this. They are very important, but so is how you live your life.
Mm.
And I love to look at this. There's a study in the blue zones that came out and they said, well, okay, we all want to live to 100 and be healthy. And we're doing all these things in the United States, cold plunges and all this biohacking stuff that sounds very esoteric. But why don't we go and look at some people who have already achieved this and see what lessons we can learn from them? Did they do cold plunges? Are they on a certain diet? What are they doing? So they went to Sardinia, which is one of the 5 blue zones, and that happens to be the part that's in Italy, and it happens to be the blue zone where there are the most 100-year-old men who are living healthy lives. These are not in old age homes or anything. They're sitting around park benches talking to each other, and they're really, there are pictures of them. They're very inspiring. And what lessons can we learn from these folks? And they came away with 3. And here were the 3. Yeah, I always do this in a webinar presentation. I have pictures to illustrate it, but imagine Sardinia is one of the hilliest areas in the world, and you cannot go anywhere without walking up steps or right. So the first thing to learn was live in an area where there's lots of steps, which can be translated to they walk everywhere, uphill, downhill, just you can't get anywhere without walking in Sardinia. So live where there's a lot of steps. Most of them are shepherds. So they go out in the hills with their sheep. They spend a lot of time around gentle animals. That was the second lesson. And the third lesson, which was number 1 with a bullet that trumped every other lesson from any of these places, was make friends and family your number 1 priority.
Mm.
You want to live to 100? You want to be healthy? You want to be in the best shape you could be for 100, and you'll be able to do all these things like lift groceries, and that's what and the way we take that and apply it to our lives, obviously we're not going to spend lots of time around sheep if we're not shepherds and we're not living in the hills of Italy. But that notion of spending time around non-toxic things and people and animals that bring gentleness and kindness and harmony into your life is a big lesson. And the third one, the one that is the most important, is making friends and family your priority. And the health benefits of that are incalculable. They are incalculable. They trump all this other stuff. I mean, for God's sake, Stephen Hawking, the great physicist who lived in that wheelchair and had that horrible, horrible, crippling thing and had to communicate, was reportedly one of the happiest and most well-adjusted people on the planet.
Yeah, it's amazing.
So it's amazing. So can you imagine what you could do if you tried to get some of that in your life and you weren't in a wheelchair and communicating with a tube?
Yeah. Yeah, it's so wholesome. And I'm really glad that you mentioned that biohacking is, I think it's a great thing, but so many of us,
I've spoken at the biohacking conferences. I'm all for it. But what
yeah,
I'm saying is, let's get down to brass tacks. What really works?
get some
That's what really
foundations.
works.
Yeah. Yeah, it's good because a lot of people kind of skip over those foundations and want to jump into the cold plunge and do all these other things, but they haven't got their foundation in place, and they're not sleeping and they're not getting real food in, and that is the place to start, whatever the health problem may be. But it's been so lovely talking with you. I could
Well, we've
listen to
done already.
you
Wow, that was
all
fast.
day. Yeah, I know it flew by, and I could listen to you all day. It was so fascinating. How can our listeners connect with you and listen to more of what you've got to say?
If you go to my website, which is jonnybowden.com, there's no H in Johnny, so it's JONNYBOWDEN, jonnybowden.com. It has blogs and it has what I'm doing, and it has a way to connect with me personally if you want to do coaching, and everything that I'm doing is on there. My social media handle is @JonnyBowden on Instagram and
Amazing.
Dr. Jonny Bowden on Facebook.
Awesome. And that will all be in the show notes as well. So thank you so much again for taking the time out to talk with me today. It's been really amazing.
It's been such a pleasure. Thank you so much, Louise, for having me. I appreciate it.
Thank you. Wow. How fascinating was that? This is going to be such a great one to share with a friend or family member if you know that someone is worrying about their cholesterol or their heart health, or maybe they've been told that they have high cholesterol or something like that. So make sure you share it with them. Now, I want to ensure that I'm bringing you the information that you need with this podcast. And that means that I need your questions. And I have a way that you can easily ask me a question, which is by visiting speakpipe.com/Louise Digby. And you can leave me a voice note there, and then I'll answer your question on the podcast. Please subscribe to Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and YouTube. And if you're enjoying this podcast and you want more inspiring content, then that's what you need to do. Subscribe to those channels. And I want to leave you with a message, which is this: you have the power to heal your body and your mind through your actions and your behaviors. You have the power, and small changes can make that happen.